Is the evidence for an allegedly old Earth really that overwhelming?
There's an abundance of evidence in creation for an older world.
I'm critiquing the claim of Gavin Ortlund, suggesting that science assumes an old Earth and how this sloppy assumption leads to even more absurd claims about the Bible and Genesis 1. So what I'd like to show you in this video is how these claims are an exceedingly weak and presumptuous argument. Also, you know the drill. Please like, share, and subscribe as it helps support this ministry. Also, leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this topic. To add just a little context, the creation account in the Bible brings in a fair amount of controversy because of supposed contradictions with the deep time claims of modern science. You know, billions versus thousands of years. Now, when we talk about physics, things get a little murky, and there are points to be made on both sides. For example, young Earth creationists need to explain how distant starlight reaches the Earth. On the other hand, according to some physicists, deep time seems to contradict the existence of things like comets, planetary rings, and spiral galaxies, things that wouldn't seem like they have a long shelf life. This is what I mean. When we talk about physics and astronomy, we're stuck in a theoretical point-counterpoint system, where it's hard, in my opinion, to arrive at any definitive conclusions. So again, from the argument of physics alone, and I say this since time itself is part of the natural creation that God made ex nihilo, and relativity, for example, can make our understanding of time and creation very subjective. Do you understand what I mean by that? According to Einstein's theory many years ago, time itself is relative and is subject to things like gravitational forces and our travel relative to the speed of light. So what I'm getting at when I say that the science of physics is murky when it comes to creation accounts is that both an old universe and an apparently old universe created in 6 literal days can both have very reasonable explanations using natural laws as we currently understand them. And there's just no way to prove either one, in my experience. However, when we look at the geologic column, that's where the overwhelming evidence seems to support young Earth creationism, or at least the global flood that produced Earth's geology. And do you understand what I mean by geology? What I'm specifically talking about is the fossil record, the pancake layers. If you look at the Grand Canyon and you see different types of rock stacked on top of each other, these layers contain all of the fossils that we find in the world. What I'm saying is that they appear to be young, thousands, not millions or billions of years old, and that the alleged fossils that are within them are actually evidence of one catastrophic event that buried all of those animals. So this is where well-meaning yet misinformed Christians so often go off the rails for unknown reasons without looking at the actual evidence. And in doing so, they create very weak arguments for both Christians and non-Christians alike. Now, Dr. Ortlund is one of many contemporary Christian apologists who hold these views, yet sadly, they all regurgitate the same weak talking points. So it's my hope to lovingly challenge him and others to address these legitimate criticisms of young Earth creationism on their views. Or, in a best case scenario, to see the logic of a global flood in a young geologic column, because I feel this would help them to be better apologists. Nonetheless, Dr. Ortlund, a brilliant apologist on many issues, is brilliantly deficient on this one for 5 reasons, and here they are. Number 1, he doesn't engage the science enough and props up his argument with illogical justifications for interpreting Genesis 1 non-literally. This one may seem ironic because he has had so much criticism by people like Ken Ham for starting outside the text, so maybe his focusing on the text so much is just a bit of an overreaction. Nonetheless, his attention to the science, and specifically the science of young Earth creationism as it pertains to the very real evidences for a global catastrophic flood, are severely lacking. And just so you understand what I'm talking about here, listen to his own words about the powerful evidence for deep time.
And in general, this will be the more controversial part of the video that I hope people will have lasted to a little bit, because I want to talk about the strength of the evidence for an older universe. It's very strong. There's an abundance of evidence in creation for an older world.
In this specific video, Ortlund was responding to Ken Ham's criticisms of his view. In my preparation for this video, I actually watched several of Dr. Ortlund's videos on the topic just so I could make sure that I was accurately representing his view in his own words. And based on what I've seen, this clip perfectly represents his approach to engaging the topic by making generalizations about the science without really engaging the science at all. In fact, the only place he even mentions the fossil record in that 5-minute segment is in an unscripted generalization that the sediments beneath our feet are evidence for an old Earth.
I want to talk about the strength of the evidence for an older universe. It's very strong. There's an abundance of evidence in creation for an older world. River erosion, as with the Grand Canyon, for example, petrified wood, the fossil order, layers of sedimentation beneath the Earth's surface.
Okay, well, specifically, how? Because I would say the exact opposite. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is a gross and negligent overstatement on the part of the evolutionary community. But here I just wanted to show you that the bulk of his content deals with justifying his interpretations of deep time in the biblical text, ironically, without engaging the science of flood geology and catastrophism. But here's the thing. This is a massive problem for old Earth creationists. It makes their arguments weak, and I would add it doesn't help complete the work of triage toward young Earth creationists, the work that Dr. Ortlund claims to care so much about. So point number one, he ironically doesn't engage the science of a young Earth. And this is something he and other Bible teachers will have to do in order to maintain credibility for their own views. And hopefully once they do, maybe they'll even change their mind on the subject. Okay, problem number two. Ortlund is dismissive of the obvious truth that you literally have to start outside the Bible to embrace an old Earth. He is again in this video responding to this particular accusation from Ken Ham, yet he interestingly uses the example of Augustine's wrestling with a literal reading of Genesis 1. What he misses about his example is that Augustine is also starting outside the text to arrive at his conclusions. I just think this is funny because Ortlund seemingly takes so much offense to the accusation by Ham of being outside the text, yet it's completely true, and you would think the best thing to do would be to own rather than deny it. It is indeed a factual statement and borders on gaslighting to claim that you're not. Now, just to be honest with you for a moment, how on earth would anyone arrive at a non-literal interpretation of the 6 days of creation without starting outside the text and using their own logic or cultural biases? Along these lines, the more appropriate question to ask is not whether we can find a couple of theologians who struggle with a literal reading, but how did the original Hebrew readers most likely take the creation account? I'm talking the ones that lived 3,500 years ago, who Moses originally wrote the text to. This is important, and at this point, I want to emphasize that I'm not outright dismissing old Earth views of Genesis 1. I'm simply and logically saying that to do so because we're wondering what is possible in the realm of interpretation rests on the wrong starting point. What we should be asking is not what Augustine or some other random church historian thought, because I think this comes with its own issues. Issues like, how do we know Augustine wasn't being just as influenced in thought, ideology, and reason by the leftovers of the pagan Roman world? These cultural and ideological influences are the same things ancient Hebrews have dealt with as their worldview expanded into other cultures before the Romans. And if we're not being naive, we will realize we are dealing with the same things today in all areas of what we call science. The other thing I take issue with is his misguided or even disingenuous use of Augustine to promote the modern understanding of old ages. This is just misguided logic at best, and at worst, disingenuous, I would say, because Augustine, like any other theologian before the mid-19th century, would have fit within the realm of what we call today young Earth creationism. And what I mean by this is that the instantaneous creation of Augustine was based on his own logic outside the text and came from his inability to logically rationalize light before the sun existed. From my perspective, I'm really not sure why he struggled so much, as the whole act of creation was very supernatural, regardless of your views on the age of the universe. And it's said in the New Jerusalem, there won't be any need for light because God's presence will light the city. So I don't struggle with this, but for some reason, Augustine did. Nonetheless, his views as we understand them didn't in any way reconcile themselves with modern views of old ages. The closest thing to which we would see in the ancient world was the pagan Greek understanding of an eternal universe. Again, the right question we should be asking is, how would the original Hebrew audience walking in the wilderness have understood this? To ask any other question violates the most basic principles of biblical interpretation. And I really just think this is an area where old earth creationists need to be more honest and take the L. Okay, point number 3. Ortlund casually dismisses or doesn't mention at all the overwhelming evidence for a young geologic column and one catastrophic global flood. Like I said when I started, this is an important point because things get a little murky presenting evidence from physics, and the conclusions are often not yet provable. This is why prominent theories are constantly being upended, and this is just an observation on my part. So if this is the case, why should we believe the current prominent views? And more importantly, why would we completely write off evidence in physics for a young universe or theories that might point to this conclusion? Truly, contemporary science has a uniformitarian bias, meaning they assume deep time. That's what uniformitarianism means. Nonetheless, these same grounds for debate in physics become incredibly one-sided when looking at Earth's geology, and specifically the fossil record. And I don't understand why Ortlund and others don't ever bring these points into their conversations on the topic. In my opinion, it makes them look uninformed. Instead, they make generalizations from old Earth science and unfortunately even accuse the young Earth view of ignoring science. This part of the rhetoric, coming from supposed believers and individuals claiming to be committed to the work of triage at that, is totally unacceptable. What I would suggest is for Dr. Ortlund and others to spend some time researching the evidences for a global flood, very specifically, as so many accomplished scientists take this view. That is, if they are going to continue to make these kinds of false claims. Now, unlike that community, I, as a pastor, have actually spent a great deal of time addressing these issues in my content. I haven't taken the cop-out that I'm more of an expert in theology. No, I've actually engaged the science of a global flood, and that's how I've arrived at my conclusion of a young Earth. Now, admittedly so, this young geological column informs my view of a literal 6-day creation. In other words, my understanding of a literal Genesis 6 informs my view of a literal Genesis 1. But I can certainly say that my view is consistent and logical and does not violate any laws of contemporary science as I currently understand them. But regardless, let's talk about that literal global flood for a minute, because these are the points Ortlund, William Lane Craig, Michael Jones, Trent Horn, and others never address. At least I never see them addressed. And it's why their arguments will always fall flat for me. One of the most simple and easily observable evidences for a young Earth is that sedimentary rock layers make up the geologic column. Now just stop and think about that for a moment. If you've ever taken a basic science class, you know sedimentary rocks are created by leftover sediments from water or a flood. These types of rocks, sedimentary rocks, make up the entirety of the geologic column. That means that all of those rocks, all of those sediments, and the fossils that they contain had to be put there by water. Another observable point is that there is little to no evidence of erosion between those geologic layers. There is also the existence of fossils. Remember, fossils have to be buried rapidly. If you're like me and you remember you were taught when you were in 6th grade how fossils form, a fish dies, it falls to the bottom of the lake, and then over millions of years, it eventually turns into a fossil. That's not true. Something has to be buried rapidly to keep it from other animals and nature having its way with the remains of that dead animal. How are things buried rapidly? By something like water or ash. Now, you may not realize this, but models for catastrophism, and that is the young Earth view of the mechanisms that produced a global flood, would include lots of volcanism, lots of igneous rock forming at the same time and burying lots of these animals and organisms that would later become fossil fuels. Nonetheless, one big event that happened very quickly. And then there's something that's a little more precisely scientific, which is the presence of carbon-14 in all layers of the fossil record, including fossil fuels, and even diamonds. Now, before you go too far on this issue, I really want you to stop and think about this for a moment, because you may hear carbon-14 dating and you may think, doesn't carbon dating prove millions of years and prove that fossils are millions of years old? No, that's other forms of rock dating that they lie to us with, because carbon-14 can only last, in theory, up to 100,000 years in a dead organism. So if there's carbon-14 in fossil fuels that are supposedly millions of years old, carbon-14 in diamonds, carbon-14 in dinosaur bones, and other organisms, doesn't that scientifically suggest that these things are not and cannot be millions of years old, nor the rock layers that they are buried in? These are things that old Earth advocates must address in order to maintain credibility. And here's another simple one: stasis in the fossil record. And I'm talking about 250 million year old alligators and many other animals. That's right. Animals that supposedly stayed the same. That's what stasis means. These animals have stayed the same for millions and millions of years. I actually came across a book a couple of years ago that cataloged some 250 examples of this. How do you honestly, logically explain that without just explaining it away? Because to the average thinking person, that literally seems absurd. Another thing to think about: one global flood serves as a mechanism for Earth's ice age. You know, the ice age that we were all taught about in school, and woolly mammoths and the glaciers and all of that stuff. Well, what mechanism do we have for that in an old Earth paradigm? I know what evolutionists would say because I've studied their view. The Milankovitch theory: wiggles in the ocean floor, variations in the Earth's magnetic field produced multiple ice ages? Really? It would seem to me that one catastrophic flood and then the ice age that followed that we see in the fossil record makes a lot more sense. Okay, so lots of points of evidence there for a young Earth in the geologic column, and there's lots of other ones that you can research on your own. These are just some of the basics and some of the big ones. But here's the kicker, and this one has just come about in the last 20 years or so. It's the presence of soft tissue in dinosaur bones and the earliest organisms we find in the fossil record. Stop and think about that for a moment. Research what evolutionists are saying and the explanations that they are giving for this soft tissue, which was discovered by an evolutionary scientist back in 2006, by the way. I assure you, you will literally have to take your brain outside of your skull and set it on the table in order to have a conversation about it with them, because it makes zero sense. There is literally no way in the physical universe you can have soft tissue in something that is older than 10,000 years. So from a young Earth perspective, if carbon-14 pushes the dating of the geologic column to 100,000 years, the existence of soft tissue pushes it even farther down into the tens of thousands of years at the absolute most. Again, this is just part of the conversation. This is a formidable list. I would say an unassailable list of proofs for a young Earth. These specific evidences, and all of them, must be addressed, and honestly, by old Earth views if you want to remain credible, since they overwhelmingly repudiate old Earth claims of radioisotope rock dating and ice cores. Point number 4, Dr. Ortlund doesn't acknowledge or possibly even see the logical weaknesses of the evolutionary viewpoint. Things like 6 tranquil floods instead of 1 catastrophic event. That's right. Evolutionists believe that the Earth was flooded not once, but 6 times, and it's not something they often like to talk about. And what about the speculative nature of supposed missing links and the many examples of fraud? I actually spend a great deal of time on these issues in other videos, so I don't want to cover it all here. But again, these issues need to be addressed in order to make a more solid argument for an old Earth. And in my opinion, they just can't be. That's why I don't believe in an old Earth view. Nonetheless, Ortlund and others spend little to no time on these issues, and their statements to the contrary are assumptive generalizations. To be honest, there are many PhD scientists across all scientific disciplines that reject what's become conventional old Earth models for many of the same reasons I've just mentioned. Why not interact with or interview some of them on your channel? The truth is they are far more qualified than you or me to speak on these issues, and I think the dialogue would be interesting. But at the very least, don't say young Earth views are dangerous or act like they are intellectually inferior. It makes you come across as smug and, from my perspective, uninformed yourself. Finally, Ortlund asserts, like most other old Earthers do, that openness to an old Earth view is essential for evangelism, as he does here.
I address this because I have deep in my heart a sincere worry of honestly, I just see this happening so much. Suppose someone's a freshman in college and they're in a geology class. They were raised in the church and they're a Christian, and the extent of their engagement in creation issues has basically been maybe a couple sermons, hear about it a little bit, and they're not aware of anything beyond that. And then they were struggling with their geology textbook, and they're kind of surprised at how versatile and subtle and strong the evidence for an older Earth is. It kind of feels conspiratorial to think all of this data is wrong. And she's starting to wonder, maybe the universe is a little bit older. Now, here's the question is what's going to happen to her faith if those are her views of the options? But if she's been told that the young Earth creationist view is the only Christian view that upholds the historicity and truthfulness of Genesis, this will lead to a crisis of faith, in many cases a loss of faith, and that is what I see happening over and over and over.
I've heard many make this claim over the years, yet to me this is a horrible argument because it comes across as a projection of their own struggles with science and the Bible, and not as a desire to arrive at the right conclusion. As a person who believes in a young Earth, or at least a young geologic column, for logical and rational reasons, I feel like this dumbs down our faith and discredits the Bible. I mean, honestly, we're actually undercutting the very goal of evangelism we're trying to accomplish. And why? In my view, the church doesn't hit this issue hard enough. And I'm actually incredibly grateful for the work of organizations like Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, and others. I mean, think about it for a moment. If we can scientifically prove a global flood, doesn't this make our evangelism significantly easier? Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Paul in Acts 17 spoke of creation, God making all men from one man, not from one original organism or evolution, and of God's universal judgment to a pagan people in Athens who had literally zero frame of reference for what he was saying about the Jewish narrative and his Messiah. He didn't dumb things down. He told them the truth. And isn't this judgment that Paul was talking about to the Athenians what a very real worldwide flood represents? Doesn't it tell us and the world that the future judgment is a very real thing and that we must repent and believe in Jesus in order to be saved? In a world of unbelievers, I just see this as making our work of evangelism easier. I see it as helpful. Certainly it has been helpful for me and for countless others. For Dr. Ortlund and many others, however, they feel the opposite. For them, evolution and old ages help them to have a more firm faith. For them, it apparently helps their evangelistic efforts when they tell people, you don't have to believe in a young Earth and a global flood to be a Christian. A statement that all young Earth Christians I'm aware of agree with, including Ken Ham. This is not an essential issue. Who's saying that it is? I'm not. But just like they can say, I or others are, quote, dangerous or uninformed, I can likewise say, and legitimately so, that your view has historically been destructive to Western culture, and it's illogical and ultimately untrue. And to suggest that you are concerned about young earth zeal on evangelism seems to follow the same logic people use when they say we must provide surgeries to minors so they don't hurt themselves. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? It sounds like Dr. Ortlund and others are saying we need to spoon feed an old earth to non-believers so that they can become Christians. But can't we just challenge them with the truth as we see it? Wouldn't that be better for their overall health and spiritual well-being so that they are making a more informed decision about being a Christian? In your view, God was dumbing down the creation account to a group of childlike Israelites who didn't have the mental capacity to understand long ages. But it seems to me that you might be taking this view because that's exactly what you're doing to this generation. It's a form of projection because of your own struggles. And I, like you, am not saying you cannot hold your view. I'm just saying that if you present yourself as a scholar and an authoritative Christian teacher, to accurately represent mine. Friends, what are your thoughts? I hope you found this video helpful. I thought the topic important because I don't often hear it addressed in the thoughtful way that I did here. So I hope it also gets some traction for that reason. You know the usual, like, share, subscribe, and until next time, it was great to gospel with you.